Friends, welcome back to another Pints with Jack Skype session, and I am joined by Andrew Lazo.
Cheers.
Cheers, Andrew. We're both drinking, by the way, out of our Pints with Jack glasses. We both actually have Macallan 12. Look at the amberness of that. I mean, isn't that beautiful?
Yes. Okay.
For those that know, we do tasting on the podcast. These Skype sessions more informal and shorter, so we won't spend much time doing the tasting side, but never be fooled. We will be enjoying them as we have this conversation still.
Yes, we will.
What we're talking about today, this is released when Letter 1 was released on the podcast. So if you haven't listened to that, go listen to Letter 1.
Great conversation between David and Trent Horn, yeah?
It really was, and that's why Andrew and I are here, because, we felt a little bit left out, and, we felt like we had stuff to say. But no, that's the beauty of these Skype sessions, is because we are bringing on other guest hosts, and now we have 3 continuous hosts with Andrew, that in certain weeks that some of us won't be talking on it, but there's other perspectives that we'd like to provide. And so that's what we're going to do today. And they had, like you said, a great conversation. They really went into jargon, and Trent, being an apologist and a brilliant apologist, very much focused on that side of it. What I wanted us to start with was what jumped out to me in this chapter, particularly, was when he talks about the patient, and the patient the patient can start using reason, and if he starts reasoning, they could twist it, they could take it away, but the danger is, Screwtape points out, you don't even want him going down that place, because he starts thinking about universal things. Instead, let's just have him focusing on immediate sense experiences. So I underlined the universal things and the immediate sense experiences. And that made me think of St. Augustine when he talks about, he talks about the high ordered goods, lower ordered goods, or eternal, temporal, and how we want to orient our hearts and our desires to be able to focus on the eternal. And the temporal is not bad. It's just in our fallen state, sometimes the temporal ends up trumping the eternal. And that's what becomes dangerous.
Yeah. Well, and I think he owes a great debt to Augustine. Don't you think in some ways the whole premise of the book and his whole method is Augustinian?
Yes, because what does Augustine write? You'll probably be able to say this better than myself, but the disordered sin is when you love something in the wrong way, to the wrong degree, in the wrong form, or something like that, which is all this is. This is twisting so much desires, which are good, but when they're twisted, they become bad. And that's what Screwtape wants to do.
Sure. Well, and your listeners who have read the space books, the Ransom trilogy, the interplanetary romances, will remember that the enemy in that book is called the Bent One. And that's Paralanter is written in 42, right? And so the way that Weston is trying to bend arguments is very much like the way the enemy is bending arguments here in Screwtape Letters. And so, twisting something out of place, out of proportion, because the devil can't create anything good. Everything God made was good, but the devil can twist it. I mean, a dram of whiskey is a great thing, but for a lot of people, in a lot of ways, it's not a good thing at all. And so it's the enemy taking something that God has created as good and twisting it out of the way. And you're right to trace that straight back to Augustine.
Was it Chesterton that said, I've always attributed it to him, and I took a Chesterton course. I think I was taught this, but I can't ever actually find it. There's nothing wrong with beer, sex, and money. Just greed, drunkenness, and I can't remember, and sex out of marriage or something. He has a shorter way of saying it, but yes, fornication.
Oh man, that sounds so Chestertonian. No, my Chesterton knowledge is small, and that's perfect. That's I think exactly what's going on. And later on in the book, we'll find the enemy saying, "We want all extremes are good except for an extreme devotion to the enemy." So make your man an extreme pacifist, make your man an extreme patriot. Just make him extreme. And that's, I think, what we're in danger of seeing, even in this election season. I think, our American system is set up to be bipartisan. I mean, it's right there in the Constitution. But I think what Screwtape really wants, I think it's worth spending some time thinking, what does Screwtape want me to say about the election? What does he want me to think about the election? And fundamentally, what he wants us to do is hate each other, right? And that's one of the things I love about the Screwtape letters. If the two great commandments are to love God and to love our neighbor, what the enemy is doing in here is trying to mess with our love of God or mess with our love of neighbor. And I think that the third kind of prong of that, at least in my own theology and ministry, is not only me loving God and loving my neighbor, but also receiving and understanding the love of God. So we talked about clarity and charity last time. I think the most important thing in the universe is grappling with the fact that God really loves me. And if I lived a day as if God was absolutely incredibly height and depth, in love with me, how would that change my behavior? And Screwtape is going to try to mess with those three things all the time. In my own life, when the enemy is successful and then I catch him, usually I catch him because Lewis has written about him, and then I defend against that, I usually will have some success there, but then the enemy will try somewhere else. But I think it's always about the commandments and our grappling with the image of the love of God in us.
I'm really glad you brought that up. Oh my goodness, the thought just slipped my mind. What I was going to say.
And we've been talking about love, quite a bit, and that kind of fits into the twisting. It's certainly one of the things that the enemy does. Yep.
But there was something too in this chapter that I really appreciated, which is when you talked about distractions. And so in my own spiritual journey, and listeners know this, I talk about this a lot. I believe that when we think of the ordering of loves, we think of the universal issues, we think of the temporal, and those there's also a practical side to it. So Augustine wrote so much about how it takes, we need God's grace to be able to overcome this and to transform our desires and to order them properly. And he's obviously correct with that statement. But I've also found in my own spiritual journey the ability to practice fasting and to practice certain spiritual disciplines, is maybe the word I'll use, or spiritual practices that allow you to have more mastery over your desires. So a person like Screwtape can't go and put the thought, like here, which he did in this letter, of this person needs to eat now. I'm hungry. And that takes you away from doing what you're supposed to be doing. And so for me, in my life, spiritual practices and disciplines have been so important to opening up and receiving that love. That's actually what I was about to say earlier, by the way. It just came back to me, was when you talked about the goodness of, imagine if you lived that way and believing that. My buddy and I always talk about how, do I really believe God is truly good and desires my best? Which of course he does, but do I believe it? Because you're correct. Every single day, if you actually lived out of that place, he's all powerful. So everything, if you are open to receiving it, you can see everything in a different light, that, maybe there's actually a lot of good coming out of this event that I don't really like, or this suffering.
Well, it says that we are in his hands, right? Jesus said, all the Father gives to me will come to me, and no one can take them out of my hands. It says that he has engraved our names in his palms, right? And it also says in the Psalms that in his right hand are pleasures forevermore. We are in his hands, and pleasure is his invention. And why don't I ever kind of set my heart to go after the real pleasures? We were talking before about how many cat videos that we have watched repeatedly. And that's something that we'll talk about in a later letter. Screwtape upbraids Wormwood for allowing his patient to have real pleasures, to read a book he really enjoyed. And I think that that's, some of our Puritan legacy in America, where we are a little wary, a little chary of pleasure. But pleasures properly enjoyed are given to us by God. I wanted to mention something. I had this great opportunity. When was it? I was in Houston. It was a couple of years ago. And Brent Harris was Screwtape for Screwtape on Stage, Max McLean's wonderful Fellowship for Performing Arts production of that. And Max was out of town doing Most Reluctant Converts, so he asked me to come and do the talkbacks, a little 10-minute Q&A after the show. So cool. And then I went out to the lobby just to take more questions because I'm an extrovert and I love talking about Lewis. I'm sure that'll be a surprise to most of you.
I'm an introvert.
Well, cheers to that. A little girl, 13 years old or something, she said, "Why is he called the patient?" And I didn't know. I'd never thought of that. But I'm an external processor. And so quickly, I kind of came up with the answer. If I'm a patient, where am I going to go? I'm going to a doctor, right? Mm-hmm. And what is the doctor going to try to do to me?
Prescribe you a cure or something.
Yes. I go to the doctor because something is wrong, and the doctor is going to make that thing better. Mm-hmm. In Screw Tape, I don't go to the doctor comes to me, not because something is wrong, but because something is going well, and he's going to try to prescribe something that will make it worse. And that's, I think, why we call it a patient. But I would never have thought of this without this 13-year-old girl. And when you talk about the pleasures and the ordinary and order in your life, how often do I fall into the enemy's trap of doing kind of the very opposite? It's Romans 7, of course. What I want to do, I don't do.
That's exactly right. Have you ever heard of Ruth Haley Barton?
No. Tell me about her.
Okay. Long story short, so she's a Christian author and writes a lot of books, and a big part of her journey, she's not Catholic. I go to a retreat in Chicago. I've been going for almost 2 years now. It's once a quarter, and I actually only have 2 more left. But long story short, she's very big on spiritual practices and how that orients your heart. So she's very big in liturgical practices. She loves icons, speaks about fixed hour prayer, and all of these disciplines that create essentially the space for Christ to form within you. And some listeners will know, because I've talked about this before, but it's probably been 6 or 9 months since I've brought it up. And I always like to remind people that these practices are designed to do what we were just talking about with the ordering of those loves. When you create that space, it allows Christ to form within you. And what you mentioned, it allows you to receive that love. Because if I go through my life and never create space for Christ, and I come home from work and let's just say I mindlessly binge out on some YouTube stuff, as we were talking about with cat videos, or some Netflix stuff. Again, those aren't bad, but when they're done too much, they're preventing you from even creating a space to contemplate Christ's love for you, that, as Henry Nouwen said, that we are his beloved, and to be able to experience and live out of that. So I'm a big believer in attempting to minimize distractions. You're never going to get rid of them all, and to create that space. I'm curious, just in your own experience, what practices you have developed and how your journey with that has been to develop the love that it's so evident you have when you speak and your heart.
Well, thank you. So much of it comes from Screw Tape, and I think I'm paraphrasing it. I'm not sure that the exact phrase is here, but it's somewhere in Lewis. But Screw Tape reminds his Wormwood to not connect physical position with prayer. But Lewis says the body needs to pray too.
Yep.
And so I was raised in no faith at all. I was an evangelical for much of my Christian background, and in many ways still am. But I've come closer and closer to the liturgy, and now I'm training for the Episcopal priesthood, in part because I love how the liturgy in many ways takes me out of myself. I literally never get on my knees to pray except when I'm in church. And I'm in a church where, thankfully, they have kneelers, but I'm mindful to kneel. I'm mindful to kneel before Christ's presence in the Eucharist, whatever that mystery is.
Yep.
And set prayers, a combination of set prayers and extemporaneous prayers, those are incredibly helpful too. I love icons. Yep. And I never thought that I would. I wasn't raised to love this stuff, but it becomes this kind of way of looking through a stained glass window towards the reality of God as filtered through that person's life. And the scriptures work the same way. And so I've adopted kind of some of these physical practices. In fact, I carry around in my pocket, I have it in my other jeans, I carry around in my pocket a prayer rope. And on my way to church, I'm serving at a church this year. On the way to church, I'm going through this Orthodox prayer rope, and with each knot, I'm praying the Jesus prayer. O Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And sometimes, honestly, I'm just saying the words with my mouth. I'm not even thinking about them. I'm thinking about something else. But the prayer catches me while I'm praying, or sometimes later in the day. I'll just say, oh, Lord, and the rest of the prayer will tumble out. Oh, Lord, Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And that wouldn't have happened had I not just trained my lips by muscle memory to say that thing. And so Screwtape wants us disconnected. And I think that the Lord wants us to connect and integrate. And Lewis and Mere Christianity says Christianity is the religion that loves the body, that loves physical things. In fact, God loves the body so much that he took one on, for his son. And so that's I think a crucial part of some of my practice.
I almost picture Screwtape, because today it does seem like liturgy and some of these practices we just talked about can get a very bad rap. They're habitual. Sure. You're not really in it. You're just doing it, going through the motions. And I feel like that's Screwtape trying to twist what really is the beauty of these practices, and you phrase it very well. They take you out of yourself. Yes, of course, sometimes do we just go through the motions? Yes, that's a danger, and we have to be careful not to just make it about going through the motions. But the obedience to that practice is so beautiful.
Well, let me ask you this. How often do I allow myself to go through the motions of sin?
Wow.
And how have I trained myself to indulge myself? And so, and that's part of what, you pick up from Lewis. Sure, great. Maybe I'm just going through the motions and my mind is a million miles away, but my body is in church. And my mouth is saying the things. And if I will if I'll at least start with my mouth, sometimes my body will follow along. Lewis in Mere Christianity talks about how habit becomes, or an action repeated becomes a habit, and a habit repeated becomes a virtue. I want to be a man who is in communication with God, the essence of prayer, hearing him, speaking to him, right? Speaking by his Spirit to his Spirit, and be in communication, right? The only way I can do that is by actually saying prayers, right? And then if I say them again and again and again, then those things will start to take hold into habits. That's part of why I use prayer beads. Not because they're magic. It's part of why I cross myself, because my hands need to pray too, right? And that's something I didn't understand as an evangelical, and it gives me permission to connect body, soul, mind, and spirit, right? And so that's, and so much of this kind of permission to do this stuff, at least experimentally, which now has taken hold, it's given to me by Lewis.
Did you know, so I spent a month at Mother Teresa's place in Calcutta back in 2011. And the sisters would, in adoration for an hour every day after working, so about 6 p.m., they'd be on their knees on the cement floor for 30 minutes of it for the rosary period, and then 30 minutes of more meditation or contemplative time, silence, and then sometimes they would sit cross-legged, but for 30 minutes on a cement floor on their knees. And I started to just out of pride, I was like, I got to keep up with them, because these are 50, 60, 70-year-old ladies, and they're doing this. I mean, their knees were so hard. It was insane. It really does orient you. So then fast forward to 2014, when I had my conversion of heart and came back to Christ in a really big way, was when I was at a retreat and I decided to get on my knees, and there was a kneeler there, and I said, I'm not going to use a kneeler. And it just brought me back to the sisters in that moment, and I ended up bawling and crying. And it was just, I don't think it's a coincidence that it was on my knees for about 2 hours straight in just pure cement floor. And that experience happened. There's just something about the body was in it, and it allowed my mind and my heart to be in it. I don't think I've ever actually shared that on the podcast.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, and we talked last time about Orwell getting on her knees as granting her vision. I love what you said. It was pride that made you kneel. Yeah. And so that's like the opposite of Screwtape. Michael must have been working with you, right? Because he was using your pride to humble your body, which years later became this position where just as soon as your knees touch, that God was able to connect the spiritual with the physical. Yep. And that's just, that's living, I think, incarnationally. That's Emmanuel, right? That's God with us in the physical, and in the now. I love this at the, yeah.
Oh, no. Go with that. I was just going to ask you, once you do that, is there anything that jumped out in the chapter to you?
Yeah. Just one more thing, and I know that these are supposed to be 10 minutes, but I've never talked about Lewis for 10 minutes in my life, except maybe in my sleep. And I know that David and Trent touched on this. Keep pressing on him the ordinariness of things. But the thing that jumps out, and when I would teach this in high school, it always surprised them, because we have bought into the lie of the distinction between the sacred and the secular, the distinction between religion and science, and that really is a lie. Above all, do not, this is what Screwtape says, do not attempt to use sciences, I mean the real sciences, as a defense against Christianity. They will positively encourage him to think about realities he can't touch and see. And so the point of the sciences is to think about the realities that we can't touch and see. And that's all training. Everything that we go through can be training for God, right? Or can be a way that the enemy is going to try to get us not to love him, not to love each other, or not to see clearly his love. And so it's this real battleground that's going on. But I love that the physical sciences also are proclaiming the glory of God. That's when you actually study them. Briefly, yes, I read Dawkins' book and had some conversations with him, a couple, and on the surface, it kind of made me an atheist a little bit. But then when I really actually started reading some of the beauty of creation, it makes you it more shows you the beauty and the grandeur of God. It doesn't prove him wrong. Yeah. Well, I'm so blessed. I'm sure it sounds like name dropping, but for me, it's just exulting that this kid from California, that I've gotten a chance to do some of these things. So at one of the Oxford conferences, 2011, I'm there with Francis Collins, who at that time was the head of the Human Genome Project. And now he's Anthony Fauci's boss. He's the head of the National Institutes of Health. And Francis is this wonderful believer who wasn't a believer growing up. And somebody challenged him, and he realized he met cancer patients who were dying. This is in my book, in Mere Christians. We got his account. And these cancer patients, one of them said, well, doctor, he said, why do you have so much joy and hope when you're dying of cancer? And she said, well, Dr. Collins, it's because of what I believe. What do you believe, Dr. Collins? And he realized that he had dismissed the claims of Christianity without examining them. Wow. And he's like, that's crappy science. That's bad empiricism. Yep. I haven't explored the hypothesis. And so he starts exploring the hypotheses, and a little Methodist minister gave him a copy of Mere Christianity, and that was huge on his way. So I'm at the Eagle and Child in Oxford, in the rabbit room where the Inklings met, talking with Francis Collins. And they were heading down to, wonderful, sweet man. Oh. And we're heading down to St. Aldate's for our next session. And I said, listen, I'm no scientist. I'm a liberal arts guy. Let me see if I understand this correctly. Science takes some segment of the known or perceived universe and repeats it or experiments with it and measures as clearly as it can this phenomenon and that phenomenon, right? And he said, yeah, that's essentially it. And I said, okay, so the fact that science can't prove God doesn't show a limitation of God. It shows a limitation of science. Mm. Because science isn't designed to study that. Science is designed for the observable, right? And he said, that's absolutely it. So if you think of science as like this line, everything that we can see, observe, postulate, everything else, and experiment on and repeat and theorize about is just this line. But there's this whole universe that's not in that stuff that we can observe and test through the scientific process. He said, yeah, that's exactly right. I'm like, okay, great. I'm done with my science for the rest of my life.
Francis Collins just said to me, yes, that's exactly right.
I'm good.
I'm done with life.
It's all the validation that I ever going to want. So, but that was helpful to see that science is dealing with those things, but science is limited by its very nature and should be. It's not trying to answer some of those questions, which is why if you press a scientist far enough, they'll say, oh, well, now you're starting to talk about philosophy and that's not our discipline. But God is infused in all of that stuff, and that's one of the debts I think that we owe to Lewis, is that he kind of helps us to integrate where the devil wants to separate.
I love it. That's fantastic. Well, hopefully when David watches this, he realizes he should have had us on the episode with them.
I think they did a wonderful job, and I'm really glad for the time that we have together. What our viewers don't know is this is the exact same thing that we do when we go off air. You and I will usually spend 20 minutes or half an hour having exactly these conversations. So.
In these first two that we've done, we've actually put them around the book, but I have about 5 topics written down for Andrew and I at some point over the coming months to just sit down and have 15-20 minute conversations on, and we'll just plop them in with some of the letters, but they won't be around the letter, because I've had too many of these with you after our recordings. I'm like, all right, some people need to be able to experience this too.
Well, we'll do that. I think what might be fun too, maybe we can think about this, is just do it like a lightning round, and so what would Lewis say about this or whatever, and then just I'm limited to like 2 sentences. And then we'll go on, and then maybe we can follow up in the Slack channel.
Are you going to self-limit yourself to 2 sentences?
Dude, I could do it. I can do it.
You're working on the Claritas.
Yes. So, lots and lots of fun.
I love it. That's fantastic. Well, thank you for allowing us to contemplate the universal issues in a much deeper way here this evening as we record this. And listeners, join us next week when we'll be going further up and further in.
Great. Well, here's to Jack and and pleasures forevermore.
I love it.
Cheers, you're Andrew. Out. Do you want some of mine?
That would be great.
Okay. All right. Take care. Blessings.
Cheers, Andrew.